Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brad Thompson, and I am the Executive Director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. And I'd like to welcome you all today to our John W. Pope Lecture Series. Before we begin, though, I'd like to take this opportunity to publicly thank the Pope Foundation for their generous support of this lecture. And at this time, I'd also like all of you, the audience, to turn off your cell phones and beepers. One of the very great pleasures of my job is that I occasionally have the opportunity to invite to Clemson individuals for whom I have great admiration and respect. Our speaker today, Harvey C. Mansfield, is one such person. Harvey Mansfield is the William R. Kenan Jr. Professor of Government at Harvard University, where he has studied and taught political philosophy for almost 60 years. Either as a student or as a faculty member. Professor Mansfield has become a legendary figure at Harvard, not only because of the widely acclaimed brilliance of his books and lectures, but also as a good-natured controversialist. Professor Mansfield has never shied away from pricking the pretensions of his Harvard colleagues. As I once heard him say, introducing another speaker at Harvard, he is an enemy of the hoity-toity, the artsy-fartsy, and the namby-pamby. Professor Mansfield has written or edited some 15 books on a wide range of subjects, including books on Edmund Burke, liberalism, constitutionalism, executive power, and several on the political thought of Machiavelli. He has also translated Machiavelli's major works and, of course, Tocqueville's Democracy in America. His most recent book, his most controversial, is on the provocative subject of manliness. In 2004, Professor Mansfield received the National Humanities Medal from the President, and in 2007, he delivered the annual Thomas Jefferson Lecture sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now, as if all that weren't enough, the students here today will surely be impressed by the fact that Professor Mansfield has been a guest on the Colbert Report. And now a personal note. I first met Professor Mansfield in 1989. At the time, I was a PhD student at Brown University in Rhode Island. And I had been told at the time by friends that Professor Mansfield would be team teaching a course at Harvard that coming semester on the subject of revolutionary constitutionalism, a course that he team taught with Professor Ralph Lerner, then visiting from the University of Chicago. Now, the very next day, I took a bus to Boston and then a subway to Harvard Square and went to Professor Mansfield's office, introduced myself, and asked him if he would mind my sitting in on his class as a kind of intellectual vagabond. He graciously agreed, and for the next 15 weeks, I made the weekly bus and subway trip to Cambridge to attend the seminar. It was, without question, the highlight of my graduate career and the single best course I ever took as a graduate student. I have never experienced such intellectual seriousness as I did that semester with Professors Mansfield and Lerner. In the years since, Professor Mansfield has been my model of both a scholar and a gentleman. This afternoon, Professor Mansfield will speak on Tocqueville's American Virtue. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I introduce and ask you to join me in welcoming Harvey C. Mansfield to Clemson University.
Thank you, Brad. That was very good of you for this somewhat over-the-top introduction. But, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure here to be at Clemson in the state of South Carolina. Kind of strange feeling for me to be in a red state. And I have to say, to start with, that it's not as warm as I was hoping. But let's see how things go and whether I can warm you up. My subject today is Tocqueville's American Virtue. Here's a preview in a couple of sentences. Tocqueville's American Virtue is self-interest well understood. It's a famous phrase. It's not his virtue, but it's the virtue he says that Americans adopt and practice. He is critical of it, but he shows his criticisms while he explains what it is. He doesn't want to attack it, and so he leaves it as Tocqueville's American virtue. That's the end of the preview. Who was Tocqueville? In case you don't know, this may be your first experience. He was an aristocratic liberal, a Frenchman, who lived from 1805 to 1859. His family came from Normandy, and there's a chateau there. You know he's an aristocrat because of the D-E before Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville. There's a chateau still there, which exists and isn't presently inhabited by a Count and Countess of Tocqueville. Two middle-aged Frenchmen with 3 children. Quite an ordinary family I once met. Tocqueville's father was imprisoned during the French Revolution and spared from the guillotine only by the fall of Robespierre in that revolution, and released, his hair having turned white at the age of 22. That was the experience of his father in the French Revolution, and yet Tocqueville lived to become or to see a democracy in action in America in 1831, when he came over here for 9 months, made a tour of the country with his friend Gustave de Beaumont, also one of those deux types. And the two of them went all around America, including to the frontier, which was then in Michigan, Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Visited Quebec because he was French, wanted to know how the French were doing in America, and took a steamboat along the Ohio River, down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and then made his way back up to New York through the South, through Florida and Georgia, the 2 Carolinas, Virginia. He went into politics. He was elected to the Constituent Assembly of the Second French Republic, which was in 1849, and became Minister of Foreign Affairs, an office which he held for 5 months. He was a philosopher who was unusually engaged in politics, and a politician who was unusually detached from politics. That's Tocqueville. Now, let's see what I have to say about Tocqueville's American virtue. To speak of virtue in America today seems strange, although in previous times and places, people did speak of virtue without embarrassment and, so to speak, naturally. Nowadays, a writer who does so assumes the burden of convincing his reader that the subject of virtue has some relevance or interest to him. This is a great change from the time when virtue was the common parlance of moralists and of common people. A very profound transformation in political or moral thought as a whole, from speaking about virtue to speaking about self-interest. Tocqueville understands that this transformation was effected with the intention of securing the political benefits that virtue had been supposed to provide. So, seeking the benefits of virtue, the Americans about whom Tocqueville writes in his Democracy in America have attempted to substitute for the habit and love of virtue proper what they call self-interest, well or properly or rightly understood. Tocqueville's Americans have little doubt of the necessity of virtue or virtuous acts, and yet they seem to have little doubt about what sort of virtues or virtuous actions are required. As is obvious, though, they do exhibit some doubt that the requisite virtue will always be forthcoming. For the moralists that you find in America are aware of a need to demonstrate the utility of virtue to those of whom it is demanded. The Americans seem to need and do have a moral doctrine, and that is self-interest properly understood or well understood. Tocqueville, in attempting to give a coherent account of American virtue, or the substitute for it, is led to doubt the sufficiency of this American doctrine. Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which was published in 2 volumes, the first in 1835 and 1840, let me tell you, the best book ever written on America and the best book ever written on democracy, all in one. This book was intended to enable the reader to see and judge by means of reflection on the example of America the full significance of the then emerging egalitarian political order, the democratic revolution which Tocqueville saw in America, a revolution towards ever more equality and perhaps, one hopes, continued liberty, or he hoped. America is studied because it exemplifies the new order in its most developed form so far. It was the new world in politics and morals as well as in geography. In democracy, democracy in America, this new democracy is identified with modern politics and political thought as a whole, as is aristocracy with ancient or pre-modern politics and political thought. Moreover, America is treated as the practical test of modern political theory. Now, in this book, Democracy in America, there is no thematic discussion of virtue, although we are given some indications of what the Americans and Tocqueville himself mean by virtue. Let me begin by noting Tocqueville's contention that in his day, the civic spirit, that is, politics, could be sustained only by the idea of rights. This is what Americans thought and what Tocqueville agreed with. The idea of rights is meant to have the same political effects that instinctive patriotism, religion, and traditional morality, then disappearing, once had. Given their disappearance, an interest in the public good might be created and maintained only by means of a demonstration that there is a necessary connection between self-interest and the idea of rights. The idea of rights is said to make it possible for men to be, quote, independent without arrogance and submissive without baseness. While submission to a government imposed by force alone would be dehumanizing, submission to an authority made legitimate by the principle of rights is humanizing. In Tocqueville's judgment, the idea of rights is a general idea, second in beauty only to that of virtue. The idea of rights applies to politics as virtue applies to the individual. It is virtue as it appears in the political world. Respect for the idea of rights, and therefore the actuality of political rights, seems to grow from the desire to protect one's own rights. Just as a man becomes aware that he possesses property, the right to which is meaningless if not defended against infringement by others, so he acknowledges the principles of rights in politics when he becomes aware of and takes pleasure in his independence and dignity. Respect for the principle, which makes it possible and necessary for each to respect the rights of others, amounts to a self-imposed limitation or moderation of the natural tendency to self-assertion on the part of each person in defense of his own goods or good. The principle of rights is bounded by, if not the same as, the virtue of justice, which may be the highest political principle. The idea of rights presupposes and completes American republicanism, which is by Tocqueville's account at the core of all that is characteristically American. In a narrow political sense, the idea of rights means, of course, the right of each and every citizen to judge and contribute to the common good. The Americans are said to assert this right because they suppose that the private good of each is dependent on the public good. So it is in the interest of each to secure the public good. More than this, because each is in part responsible for the public good and can take pride in securing it, he tends to regard the public good itself as part of his own good. This manner of thinking and acting is habitual for Americans, and it is supported by a doctrine. America's republicanism is the most fundamental of its mores, which are habits of the heart, he says. American republicanism, or what Tocqueville sometimes calls the dogma of the sovereignty of the people, declares, quote, "Providence has given to each individual the amount of reason necessary for him to look after himself in matters of his own exclusive concern." This is the great maxim on which civil and political society in the United States rests. On the whole, Americans tend to define their private goods and the public good in a specific way, and to call virtue whatever is conducive to that good. In fact, what passes for virtue in the United States might not even be recognized as anything but vice by a European. The Americans are, above all, a commercial as well as a republican people. So they honor as virtues the qualities that promote the end of commerce. American sailors, for example, are so successful and promise to make America a foremost naval power because of their moral and intellectual qualities. The spirit in which Americans conduct their worldwide commercial ventures is heroic. They pursue their commerce so ardently because the education and habits of a civilized nation create needs and desires for the goods obtained from commerce. At the same time, their conduct is so daring because they love to play games of chance in which they can display their daring. American sailors act from calculation and obey their natures. Now, in Volume 2 of Democracy in America, that's the one that was published in 1840, and especially in parts 2 and 3 of that Volume 2, which treat of the effects of the equality of conditions on the sentiments and mores of those who will live in democracies, there we find Tocqueville's critique of American morality. Understanding democracy to mean the equality of conditions, Tocqueville begins his critique with an acceptance of the fact of equality and an account of its causes. The people, we are told, have, quote, an ardent, insatiable, eternal, invincible passion for equality, for reasons more or less peculiar to modern times and accidents of history, as well as for reasons stemming from the universal character of human beings. Men in democratic ages love equality because it is the dominant fact of their time, the dominant characteristic of an era which gives rise to a mother thought or principal passion, which is in this case a love of equality. So the principal passion is a love of what is. The people love equality because they assume that what is lovable and good, and also because equality does seem to be good if it is in truth the enduring source of a life of little easy pleasures for everyone. And if that way of life constitutes a happy and good way of life for men. The tendency of the people to define and love the good as such is a fact that must be accepted by the politician or moralist, although it does not follow that one must accept that definition of the good as correct. Those who love liberty more than equality, the aristocrats, however, might well love something precious, even if it's easily lost. They might love something even while acknowledging its dangers. They might be willing to wait for anticipated benefits. They might sacrifice their comforts and strive with utmost efforts to achieve it. But that is not what is characterized by those who have a passion for equality. Now, the sentiment characteristic of and peculiar to democracy is individualism. This is a word which he almost invented, which became used first at his time, and he is really the first to have defined it. He thought of it as something bad. We think of individualism as something good, as in the phrase rugged individualism. But Tocqueville thought it was bad. Individualism, he said, is not so much a passion as a judgment, and it is to be distinguished from egoism. Egoism, which is a natural but often excessive self-love, can and has occurred in all eras. It is a blind instinct which, in causing men to prefer themselves to everyone and everything, stifles virtue. In democratic eras, egoism is guided by the opinion that each man is a self-sufficient whole. And this is individualism, that each person is enough by himself. In democracy, the only conceivable self-sufficient life is a private life, because no particular individual is powerful enough to do anything great or public. You can vote, but when you vote, you're in a mass. And you may vote in a state like yours and like mine, where one party has a decisive advantage. So why vote? This is an erroneous judgment of, Tocqueville thinks, of individualism. And it is said to begin by silencing the public virtues. But eventually it destroys all other virtues and is absorbed into egoism. Thus it is a vice as well as an error, and it is surely understood and treated as a problem by Americans. For they have devised ways to combat it, ways to combat individualism. They must combat it because they acknowledge the necessity of public virtue. This they do through certain institutions which help to habituate people to overcome or to transform their vice into virtue. Since individualism is an erroneous virtue, a judgment rather, they must also combat it with a doctrine, which is not erroneous. Americans combat the possible effects of individualism with free political institutions, associations, and a free press. Free political institutions make use of elective offices. Those who through height of soul or restless desires come to think beyond their private lives can only gain public favor and thereby the opportunity to think of the good of others by appearing to think of it. Ambition leads them to find an interest in self-forgetting or in hiding their self-love. The necessity of being concerned with the general interest leads to the choice of being so concerned, and the calculation of serving to the habit of it and taste for it. Americans excel at the art or science of forming associations to pursue their common desires. Democratic individuals are necessarily weak individuals. So to do anything great in politics or civil life, democratic individuals must either depend on their government to do it for them, or form associations which enable them to act together as if they were powerful. The Americans choose to associate, and for an amazing number and variety of purposes, and for moral and intellectual purposes as well. They have an art or even a science of association by means of which they pursue the objects of their common desires. Such a science is necessary as equality of conditions increases, or as Tocqueville puts it with apparent exaggeration, civilization itself depends on the use made of associations. Hence, the Americans have a doctrine based on the principle of self-interest properly understood, which is intended to replace a sublime conception of the duties of man as a counterpoise to egoism and individualism. American moralists respect the fact of self-interest, or is it that they make a cowardly surrender to it? But they do try to make self-interest respectable by claiming to demonstrate that virtue originates in a proper understanding of self-interest. But the moralists do not acknowledge that human beings are capable of acting out of the, quote, disinterested, spontaneous impulses natural to man. Nor do they speak of the beauty of virtue, or say that it is great to be virtuous. Nor do they even attempt to defend the position that the good is useful as distinct from the position that what is useful must be good. They do not succeed in producing true or extraordinary virtue. Although granting that this is the necessary moral doctrine for modern democracy, Tocqueville observes that the doctrine is not completely self-evident. In insisting that virtue originates in self-interest and only in self-interest, American moralists pay more honor to their philosophy than to themselves, and do an injustice to their fellows. Self-interest, well understood, or properly understood, is meant to replace the official moral doctrine held when the predominant people in the country love to form, quote, a sublime conception of the duties of man, and to make out that it is a glorious thing to forget oneself, and that one should do good without self-interest as God himself does. Thus, it is meant to replace religion or imitation of the divine as a motive for virtue. Religion, we are reminded, had been politically useful because in teaching the immortality, not to mention the existence of the soul, it served as a powerful counterpoise to the love and wholehearted pursuit of material well-being. Religious peoples are capable of earthly or political greatness because religion gives men a great enduring interest, dedication to which makes it seem reasonable and desirable for them to subordinate petty or whimsical desires to that interest. Such peoples become habituated to a life of moderate, sustained endeavor, and this habit of self-discipline makes them better able to pursue great, long-term political projects as well. While praising religion and religious peoples, Tocqueville never denies that men have material needs, that the attachment to material goods can be very strong, and that the taste for material well-being is encouraged in modern democracy. The wholehearted pursuit of material well-being does not constitute a political problem in the sense that it endangers the political and social stability which might seem to be the end of politics. On the contrary, the desire for material well-being even supports the desire for public order and stable morals. His concern is rather that religion incorporated a sublime idea, a taste for the glorious and the fitting, an aspiration to imitate an altogether superior being, while self-interest properly understood may not do that. American moralists urge that one deny 1,000 passing pleasures for the sake of enduring happiness. That is self-interest well understood, the ability to deny immediate pleasures. Someone might respond by asking what constitutes the enduring happiness of a mortal body. It is not clear that it is reasonable for human beings to make their end the preservation of the body at the expense of all its passing pleasures. For it is not clear that the body ever experiences any pleasures that are not passing. The people, we've been told, tend to understand their good or self-interest as the enjoyment of successive little pleasures, however much they seem to care about the enduring, and the Americans do tend to preoccupy themselves with the slightest needs of the body and the trivial conveniences of life. Apparently, then, it is no easy task for American moralists to inspire men with a kind of interest that require them to forego the undisciplined indulgence of their passions. In Tocqueville's opinion, they will necessarily fail if they understand or permit others to understand that they have no greater interest than the well-being of their mortal bodies. By setting long-range goals for human beings, one might hope to sustain great ambition, while at the same time moderating or even rationalizing it by submitting it to that distant end, something way off in the future, which we today are nevertheless inclined towards. In order that men find it reasonable to work for such ends, at the very least, they must suppose it possible that their efforts will bear fruit. Hence Tocqueville's insistence that one must banish chance as much as possible from the world of politics. It must not seem that the risk of sacrificing present pleasures for future happiness is too great to make it worth taking. And at the same time, it must not seem that success is so dependent on chance that one can hope for success without enduring the pains of self-restraint. The Americans are not happy. Despite their freedom, enlightenment, and happy circumstances, they are, quote, grave and almost sad in their pursuit of well-being. They have been habituated to hope for good things. But since they tend to think of the good as the pleasures of the mortal body, they labor under the awareness that they have a limited time within which to experience these goods. So while they anxiously pursue desire after desire, they are saddened at the thought of not tasting all pleasures. You make a lot of money, you retire, you decide to travel. But where? The world is a large place. Even the United States is large. Even South Carolina is large. You can't go everywhere before you die. Americans are not made happy by their pleasures because their desires for pleasure are never satisfied. They never have time to enjoy. They're always looking for something new. So these desires are insatiable because they also desire equality. And perfect equality is contrary to nature and therefore perhaps impossible. Americans have two desires that are impossible to satisfy: the desire for material well-being and the desire for equality. From Tocqueville's analysis, one might conclude that democratic principles and the doctrines they tend to justify, rather than combat certain sentiments more or less natural to most men, are worse than is American practice itself. So Tocqueville criticizes American theory, the moralists, more than American practice, which he celebrates. He recommends to us what the Americans do and show, while at the same time he criticizes the moralists in America. The American moralists err not merely in failing to acknowledge disinterestedness in human beings, but in failing to see that their very attempt to save the consistency of their theory shows that they themselves prefer to honor their philosophy more than themselves. To honor philosophy and to be moved by the desire to honor may be in one's self-interest, but it is not the same as being moved by self-interest. It is at the least to act as if the noble were useful, rather than as if what is useful is never ignoble. Americans further show that self-interest need not be understood as material well-being exclusively. For Americans appear to take political freedom and a public good seriously. It is, of course, possible that a people will prefer material pleasures to political freedom and try to pursue the former at the expense of the latter, even if they are likely to end up by losing both if they do that. It is also possible to do as Americans do, that is, to direct their passion for material well-being rather than to follow it blindly, and thus to acknowledge that political freedom is useful to ensure economic prosperity. But Tocqueville bids us to ask whether Americans do not show us something about themselves that they themselves do not properly understand, and that their doctrines do not adequately account for. For example, the elections, like the election we have just held. Tocqueville says, you have to come to America to see the extent of political activity there and believe it. If you heard of it from abroad, you wouldn't believe it. You have to see it. The number of elections, the quantity, and the hierarchy of elections, from the lowest to the highest, that we practice. Elections, he says, are the cause of American prosperity. Elections are not caused by prosperity, but prosperity is caused by elections. An American will attend to his private interests as if he were alone in the world. The moment afterward, he will be deep in public business as if he had forgotten his own business. Sometimes he seems to be animated by the most lively patriotism. But a heart cannot be really be divided in this way. Americans alternately display passions so strong and so similar, first for their own welfare and then for liberty, that one must suppose these urges to be united and mingled in some part of their being. Americans reveal their belief in a whole as well when they complete their pursuit of material well-being and their political activity with a day of repose and religion. On Sundays, Americans go to church, where they hear a strange discourse in which they learn of the pleasures of virtue and the true happiness which accompanies it. On their return home, they find in the Bible pictures, quote, of the greatness and goodness of the Creator, of the infinite magnificence of the works of God, of the high destiny reserved for men, of their duties, and of their rights to immortality. In America at its best, the natural sublime instinct that might lead to ferocious spirituality is nourished with arguments about and mental images of divine order. Or Sundays bring a profound repose in which, quote, the soul comes into its own and meditates upon itself. While virtually every religion lends some support to this activity by positing as dogma the immortality of the soul, philosophical materialism, on the other hand, teaches that everything perishes with the body. Tocqueville attacks the materialists with what is for him an uncharacteristic moral indignation. This is what he says. There are many things that offend me about the materialists. These are materialist philosophers. I think their doctrines pernicious, and their pride revolts me. By giving man a modest conception of himself, it might seem that their system could be useful. But they give no reason to suppose that this is so. Rather, when they have sufficiently established that they are no better than brutes, they seem as proud as if they had proved that they were gods. Beneath the moralism is an argument, and beyond it is an appeal to the self-interest of the materialists. In denying the premise of religion, the existence of the, quote, immaterial and immortal principle traditionally called soul, the materialists also deny the existence of that which had been traditionally offered as evidence for the distinction between human beings and brutes, and which might have been the ground and source of philosophy or science, that man has a soul or an immortal soul and animals do not. If man is to be distinguished from brute, it is presumably by his capacities for choice and his capacities for reason and science. Men pretend to make judgments, and this pretension is surely shared by the materialist scientists. The content of their science is that man is virtually a brute, but the extent of their existence of their science suggests that there must be some distinction between man and brute, since the latter does not seem to desire or to be capable of science. The alternative, that there is no desire for or possibility of science, is surely rejected by the materialists, for they believe in and take pride in science. But if they were correct in denying a fundamental distinction between man and brute, then any being capable of science would have to be a being superior to their man, that is, a god. Hence Tocqueville's comment that the materialists seem as proud as if they had proved that they were gods. A being who could prove anything would be a god. American sympathy seems to be a substitute for duty, but Americans would in any case associate and exhibit their version of social virtue out of self-interest. Americans may be equal individuals, but they are equally weak individuals aware of their weakness. By a, quote, tacit and almost unintentional agreement, each aids others with the expectation that he will thereby assure himself similar aid when necessary. The Americans are virtually compelled to act as if they were virtuous. If the association incorporates a kind of self-knowledge, it is a recognition of man's most universal and obvious necessities. Reflecting on this American manner of forming associations, someone might be led to raise the following difficulty. If the American's presumption of necessity were correct, if it were true that in human affairs necessities always or almost always dictate, then it would be hard to see why the Americans would continue to understand themselves as equally free individuals. It would in fact make no sense for them to prefer Republican politics to despotism, for both free choice and governmental responsibility would be illusions anyway. To say that Tocqueville's Americans are unwilling to reach this conclusion would be a gross understatement. And Tocqueville himself is very much concerned that it still be possible to understand Americans as moral beings who might choose virtue and who therefore are deserving of the self-respect and honor peculiar to human beings. Then some kind of doctrine is needed which makes it possible for human beings to acknowledge their necessities, or perhaps the limits within which their range of choices lie, while understanding that they are nonetheless not governed, not tyrannized by mere necessity. The idea of rights might be sufficient for the times if it enables men to be, you remember, independent without arrogance and submissive without baseness. The primacy of self-interest properly understood in American moral doctrine reflects an attempted rejection of any standard not originating with man, which nonetheless commands men's respect and makes it possible or necessary to rank human beings when measured by it. Yet self-interest properly understood would surely be an insufficient moral principle if it made it impossible for human beings to respect themselves, much less others, because it led them to believe that they acted out of an interest tantamount to a mere necessity. American moralists do not take seriously the evident beliefs that men are parts of larger wholes, the structures of which define man's interest for him by establishing his place and indicating the only ways in which he might secure his good. Or they refuse to use that evidence to formulate teachings which men might choose to follow. Instead, they attempt to regularize unstable human desires with a teaching about human needs, or about universally compelling interests as distinguished from particular desires. Their emphasis on these universal needs is supported by the materialist philosophers who attempt to establish the necessity of the order of things in which the satisfaction of such needs might be guaranteed. Tocqueville's Americans show in their practice that they have not yet accepted the full implications of self-interest properly understood, for they do not yet seem to realize that Republican politics and religion could no longer be taken seriously under that formula. Like a virtuous woman, Tocqueville enjoys talking about his virtue, and so he does that in his dignified way. At least once, he indicates that his virtue is sustained by his recollection that, quote, the greatest captain of modern times had made the same observation. In his conclusion, he indicates that there is yet another deeper cause of his virtue. Early in Volume 2, Tocqueville states his belief about the divine nature, and that belief is reaffirmed at the end of this Volume 2 of Democracy in America. He says, quote, the almighty and eternal being has a gaze that of necessity includes the whole of created things and surveys distinctly and simultaneously all mankind and each single person. Thus, the almighty and eternal being is a perfect judge. Moreover, quote, it is natural to suppose that not the particular prosperity of the few, but the well-being of all is most pleasing in the sight of the Creator and preserver of men. What seems to me to decay is thus, in his eyes, progress. What pains me is acceptable to him. Equality may be less elevated, but it is more just. And in its justice lies its greatness and beauty. I therefore do all I can to enter into understanding of this divine view of the world, and strive from thence to consider and judge the affairs of men. Thus, the Creator and Preserver is good and intends the good, without denying that the merely human standard is that of the great and beautiful. Tocqueville, sustained by his faith in nature's goodness, nonetheless submits to nature or attempts to imitate the divine judge. If Tocqueville's belief is correct, then the power that men must obey is not insuperable and unthinking, but approachable and intelligent. The proof that this power does permit nations on earth to be their own masters would lie in men's taking Tocqueville's wisdom to heart and demonstrating their strength and freedom by making the necessary corrections of democracy. Ultimately, Tocqueville's virtue is grounded on a trust in nature's intelligibility and goodness, a trust that makes possible and necessary his trust in fellow men. Thanks very much.
We have time for some questions, and it's our tradition at the Clemson Institute to take the first question or two from students, and then if there are any out-of-town guests, we'd appreciate questions then from our visitors, and then last but not least, Clemson faculty.
Last and least. That's what you really meant. Yes.
I take a lot of the thrust of what you were saying to be the importance of elevation.
Yes.
In the political arena, but also in the personal and social arenas of life.
Yes.
And something that we've lost is this sense of maybe transcendence or something higher, something beyond just limited self-interest or self-interest well understood. But what I'm interested in is, do you think that we can create or find or establish ways of thinking about elevation or ways of acting in an elevated sense without the specific religious traditions that we've inherited from the past, and specifically a lot of the what we could call baggage, and we could go there into religious wars and all these things. But do you think there's a way to have elevation without religion?
Yes. Well, good question, which is the sort of thing one says to a tough question. Tocqueville says that the way towards elevation is perhaps not religious, or the origin of it. The ways towards it is to associate with other human beings, the beginning of it. And you do that when you find some common need or good. For example, you're living in a small village. This is in the 1830s in America. And there's a danger your house might burn down. And if that happens, you're on your own. You can't combat the fire by yourself, so you need other people. So you get together with other people for this common purpose. And this is in your self-interest. And also you would have a certain orderliness to it, an organization, perhaps with a chief, and perhaps with a few lieutenants. I used to live in New Hampshire, where they had many places with still had many places with volunteer fire departments, and in my town, it had one chief and 4 lieutenants, and nobody underneath. So the orderliness of democracy requires it to, so to speak, elevate itself or give itself a certain hierarchy merely for the sake of pursuing necessities which are obvious to anyone without religion. But the question is, your question is really, how can this be sustained if there isn't religion? And his answer is, surely it cannot. He says, if a country wants to remain free, it must have faith. And if it wishes to remain without faith or in doubt, it will find it much more easy and convenient to submit to some despotic government, which might be called democracy, but wouldn't be the real thing, because it would be equality without liberty. So it's more our interest in liberty that requires this elevation, or culminating in religion. And Tocqueville emphasizes, therefore, the orderliness of religion. That religion gives you a sense of your place in the universe, and in all nature, which is somewhere between God and brutes or animals. This, in other words, human beings have a certain dignity. That means they have in their nature a certain elevation that keeps them from behaving like brutes. You can see a lot of materialist philosophers who, or materialists, which means really atheist philosophers, who may not seem to treat their fellow human beings as brutes. But over the long run, Tocqueville thinks a society without religion will tend to do that. And it will tend to deprive itself of the liberty which most obviously to most people distinguishes a human being from an animal. So he distinguishes, or he talks about the orderliness or the order that religion produces, not so much that America is a God-fearing people. It's more that God is a being to be imitated than feared. Though there's a little bit of fear too. That God sets limits to us or to our daring. But perhaps that's more by indicating that it's reasonable to respect the limits on human nature and not just to fear them.
How would you respond? Because there's been a huge demographic change in America. I mean, we've actually become more religious since the 1800s, but we've managed to keep this sense of individualism, and it's probably actually gotten stronger as well. And how would that measure in this theory?
Do we still see individualism in this bad sense? Yes. I think we do. Or when people talk about those who are too apathetic to vote, they're talking about the kind of judgment that Tocqueville calls individualism. And this judgment is seconded and encouraged in a bad way by the theorists, he says, which are characteristic of democracy. And those theorists are people who identify large forces, impersonal forces, that rule our lives and that tend to make each individual feel weak. See, what's bad is for each individual to feel weak. Because once you feel weak, then you withdraw into yourself or your friends or your family. That's what he means by individualism. And there's no longer liberty because he thinks that liberty is essentially political liberty. No, your private liberties are not safe if you can't vote. So as the Declaration of Independence says, the right to consent, that's its version of political liberty, is the fundamental right. Your human rights won't be safe unless you live in a society where you can protect them by yourself, with your fellow citizens in elections and with the exercise of political liberty. The libertarians overlook the need for individuals to be strong. You can't be strong enough on your own. So you have to associate with other people. And you have to understand that in this association, you gain strength. And therefore, you become more of an individual because you're stronger. So to speak, a member of a team. I'm talking like a football coach now. See? You become a better individual if you recognize that man has a social or political nature and it isn't simply isolated from itself, from others, by the fact that he has his own body. It's true we do have our own bodies, and only we can can feel what we feel. I can't feel your pain, unlike certain politicians. Yeah. But there's a limit, and there's a kind of difficulty in associating with other people. But that means that it's something that has to be achieved. It may be part of our nature that we like to be with other people, but it's part of our art and our habits, our good moral habits, that we can be with other people successfully. Yes? The answer is probably not. And, who knows? Who can see into the soul of another human being, especially one long past? But he himself said in a letter written later in life to somebody who asked him the same question. So I said that as a youth he had encountered philosophical books which caused him a crisis of faith. And it's unclear that he ever resolved this before he died. He had a relatively short life. He died in his 54th year because he had tuberculosis. So the biographical information seems to indicate a certain doubt on his part. And then also in what he says, he talks about the difference between Catholics and Protestants, and he was obviously a Catholic from France, but he doesn't emphasize the peculiar features of each religion, though he does think that Christianity is much more suitable to freedom than other religions, and the one he mentions especially is Islam. And the reason for that is that Christianity carries within it a distinction between church and state, or at least the germ of a distinction between church and state, such that religion is not required to become involved in politics. Or to put it a little more simply, Christianity doesn't have a political doctrine, but this has to be supplied by human law. And that means that that it's much easier for Christianity to stay out of politics than for Islamic religion, which he thought was a great danger to political liberty. He very much believed that a republic, to be free, had to have religion, but at the same time that it should make the distinction between church and state. And he said, and the reason for that is that religion becomes tainted with the purposes of this world, with the idea of worldly gain, if it gets too involved in politics. And so religion, to be effective, has to be pure. But then, to be pure, that is, in the sense of staying out of politics, means that it, paradoxically, that sort of behind its back, it has a good effect on politics, because it stands above politics for pure morals, and therefore above self-interest, perhaps even self-interest well understood. Yeah.
You said that individualism would evolve into egoism. So how do you respond to it today? Because I would argue that that has gone away from that and the opposite direction of egoism. How would you go with like today's society, as opposed to what you saw then? Are you more pleased with that, or is this more of a function of the checks that we put on, or that supposedly we put on something?
What do you understand by moving away from egoism? Oh, collectivism, all right, or socialism, something like that, yeah. He might understand collectivism or socialism as a kind of individualism, that where the government is so big and so powerful and does everything for you. I think that would be his answer. That under socialism or under communism, you still thought of yourself. You thought of yourself even more as an individual, because it made you live in fear. And you could never trust any other human being because they might report you to the police. So, I mean, this is collectivism at its worst. And so that would tend to isolate you all the more. If you've seen this a film about East Germany called The Lives of Others. So a German film came out 2-3 years ago. I very much recommend what it is like to live under such a regime. And it does force you to be more of an individual. Instead of opening your heart, it closes it. Yeah.
When Tocqueville came to America, he was a relatively young man. May have been influenced by predominant political philosophy or economic philosophy in Europe at the time. Is there one that you can point to that may have existed that was very popular?
Well, he was liberal. Liberal. By that, he was in favor of some of the French Revolution, but not of the terror consequences of it. So he thought that one should not try to return to the old regime. And although there were many in his country, in France, called the Legitimist Party, who supported such a return. And a good part of democracy in America addresses those people, the people who think that it's still possible to have a choice of going back to aristocracy. And he tries to show no, there is this providential trend, movement toward democracy, which has been going on for 7 centuries now, and you're not going to be able to push it back. So we're going to have democracy of one kind, but of necessity. But which kind? Whether with slavery or with freedom. So he was with a group. There were other liberals, in François Guizot and Benjamin Constant, and Royer de Collard, and others who took this kind of middle position between those who wanted to continue and extend the French Revolution and those who wanted to abolish it. So it was a kind of middle position in his time, where he was very much opposed to both extremes. Yes.
My question is about freedom and liberty and so forth. You mentioned that the aim of the enduring happiness of the mortal body requires the suppression of passing pleasures. You then discussed the necessity to reduce or eliminate chance, total chance in politics. My question is, does freedom depend on eliminating such chance? Or does freedom somehow interact with the presence of that chance? Would you see it as
Oh, yes, very good, yeah. Well, as to your first point, that's what he says. The moralists, the American moralists, try to say that you should go for your long-term self-interest because these immediate pleasures are passing. But if you think of yourself as a human being, which is a mortal being, then all pleasures are, because you are passing, you are not. All pleasures are passing, and maybe there isn't such a big distinction between short-term and long-term as the moralists of self-interest want you to believe. So that that's one point. But the other one is about now what did you say? Say it again. So yeah.
in pursuit of that long-term goal,
Yeah.
it's necessary to suppress short-term chance.
Oh, chance. Yes. All right. Chance. All right. That's because banishing chance, or not, which it says as much as possible, not it isn't possible completely, is for the sake of virtue. Because think of the American dream. What does that mean? Or that expression that we use. It means you play by the rules and you will succeed. In other words, you play by the rules and it won't happen that some blind fatality will destroy you and everything that you've worked for. So there's a kind of meaningfulness in the way the universe works, that that will reward virtuous endeavor on your part, and politicians need to give people a sense of this. Also, it's bad if you think that you can succeed purely by chance, because then you won't prepare yourself, say, sufficiently, and you won't read up in the encyclopedia, as Sarah Palin failed to do, about various important facts that she needed to know when examined by her betters. Yes, hi.
You pointed out that, Tocqueville points out that Americans are better than their public philosophy, self-interest rightly understood. And so I'm wondering if that better part of Americans, their interest in virtue, actually, you mentioned that, can be sustained by that doctrine. Is this doctrine sufficient to keep Americans, better than their public philosophy?
Yeah. No, it isn't. No, it isn't sufficient, and that's hence the emphasis on religion, I think, which is also American. He tries to show that an American can improve itself by looking within itself, rather than by listening to its intellectuals or its theorists or its moralists or its historians. All of those people have doctrines which are influenced too much by democratic equality, and which tend to emphasize or endorse the idea of living for material well-being alone. So he is he called himself a liberal, but a new kind of liberal, and perhaps the way to sum it up is he's a liberal with soul, and who tells you that you have a soul? Well, certain philosophers do, but above all, it's religion. I mean, certainly politically, in the great mass of people would believe they have a soul only if they believe in God, or God who makes the idea of a soul for human beings seem reasonable. So religion is, I think, the public face of whatever philosophy he might have underneath all this to sustain political liberty. And he wants Americans, as I said, to look within themselves, to watch what they are doing more than to listen to what people are telling them, what self-appointed theorists are telling them. And
He's optimistic that can be sustained in America?
and on that he doesn't make a prediction. He likes to make predictions. But and maybe that's because he knows and he wants us to think that it's up to us. And so his optimism takes the form of saying and showing that it's possible for us. Whether we're going to do it is perhaps not knowable, because that's going to be our free choice.
Seeing no more questions, I will reserve the last two for myself. Harvey, is there anything in Tocqueville's description or analysis of America that you think he got wrong? Would be the first question. And the second is, what exactly is the virtue against which Tocqueville contrasts the doctrine of self-interest well understood?
there's so much he got right, and that I'm like one of those presidential candidates. Is there anything you've ever done that you're ashamed of? You're asking me, and one hesitates to answer that question, which can open a can of worms. Because I wouldn't want to say forget about him because of this. So what shall I say? I mean, there are things he didn't foresee. He thought that, for example, that there would be a race war in America. But maybe he thought that for pretty good reasons. He didn't anticipate that that people in the North would feel as strongly about the Union as they turned out to feel. He was right that people in the North would not sacrifice or their lives or fight to remove slavery from the South. But as it turned out, at least under the political leadership of Lincoln, they were willing to fight for the Union, which had as a consequence of abolishing slavery. So he got that a little bit wrong. He thought that that it would be so difficult for blacks to live on their own once freed, that and they would be so full of resentment that the whites would take measures against them, and the blacks would all congregate to the South, and there would be a racial war here in this part of the country. So, I mean, it's not altogether wrong, but isn't the way things turned out. You could say he didn't anticipate that a leader like Lincoln would appear. But the country became much richer, more powerful, and that was another factor that maybe that the North would be so much stronger than the South at the time of the Civil War. And even so, the South almost won that war, as you probably know. Now, what is the other one about? What is the virtue? What is this American virtue if it isn't self-interest well understood? Well, that's the virtue of practicing political liberty and of believing the things which are necessary to sustain or to encourage or to endorse, confirm that practice. So that means that begins from the idea of free association, which is quite distinct in him from the idea of social contract. A social contract is in Hobbes and Locke, and that's something, a means by which you are sort of driven into society, to Locke's phrase, quickly driven into society because of your necessities. Whereas for Tocqueville, it's something that's already in society, and that you pursue associations for the sake of some good, which may be a question of private property, to be sure, but some good that you share with other people, and that you take pleasure in doing that with other people, and you take pride in it. Because for Tocqueville, pride is a great thing, whereas for the social contract theories, pride is what gets you into trouble and keeps you from recognizing the fearful condition of living outside of government. So, and I should have said, pride is a factor which you asked about his Christianity, which makes his Christianity a little bit unorthodox. Christianity being a religion of humility, but there might be a sense in which Christians take pride in their humility, if I can sort of try to square the circle in a quick and rather superficial formula. So it's these things. It doesn't have a name except the old name, namely virtue, but it is a virtue which is available to Democrats. I mean, it's to all of us as equal, and all of us as equal may we may achieve something powerful and great, a great enterprise. I think just look at what America did in the 20th century. That was something. I think that's something that we can be proud of in saving Europe and sort of the Western civilization 3 times from being destroyed by the German Empire, by the Nazis, and by the communists. So, and maybe it's 3.5 or 4 that we're now working on our friends, the Islamic hijackers. Yeah.
We'll take this as our last question.
What do you mean by equality? In what sense is equality
Yes.
in that?
Yes, good. A lot of people ask that because he thinks that America has equality of conditions, and a lot of people will say, well, what about the rich and the poor and so on, even today. In fact, especially today, it seems we have continuing inequalities. And what he means by equality of condition is something more closer to equality of status. It doesn't mean that there are no rich and no poor, but it means that each person is. He gives the example of in France. If you're a serf, you can't approach a nobleman, and whereas in America, you can. You can clap him on the back or say hello or call him by his first name, and he may not like it, but he has to conceal his dislike. So, and that everything is open to us on an equal basis, at least in principle. But in principle means that you can address, you can regard. He uses this French word semblable, which means that you're similar to somebody. We regard all other Americans, or even all human beings, as similar to one another. There are differences and inequalities, but we work with them. And so in his second volume, he talks about some of those differences, like master and servant, man and woman, and things like that, where it might seem that there are inequalities, or at least which are either natural or traditional. But he shows how democracy deals with them and sort of democratizes them. And that I think is the answer. Then that also that strict equality is something impossible.
Well, just before we finish, just a couple of quick announcements. The first, is there anyone here from the student organization thing? Right there. All right, good. This organization tomorrow night will be hosting a discussion of Professor Mansfield's lecture, and this is being held when and where?
7:30 in the Brown Room, the library.
Okay, very good. So if you want to, any of you want to continue the conversation, you can do it tomorrow night. And Professor Mansfield will stick around maybe for another 10 minutes or so before I have to rush him off to dinner for any of you who would like to meet him. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to this event. We will be having another one next semester. And most importantly, I'd like all of you to join me in thanking Professor Mansfield.
Thanks.